So we're now letting attendees file in, and I will start speaking in just a little bit. All right, so people are just filing in now. We'll start in just a bit. Okay, we are live at Verdict First, Then the Trial, a look at the First Amendment and political prisoners and the Julian Assange extradition case and the prosecution against him. I'm Nathan Fuller with Assange Defense Committee. We're at assangedefense.org, and that's the go-to place here in the United States, especially for all information on Assange and how to get involved. We are a group of lawyers, activists, human rights defenders from around the country with different branches in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Washington, D.C. and the like. And we're just organizing support for Assange, for the First Amendment, for the right to publish around the country. And just check out assangedefense.org. Assange had his extradition hearing in September, and just the other day on January 4th, his extradition was blocked, but only on medical grounds. The judge accepted the US's dangerous arguments that would criminalize free speech and the First Amendment right to publish. So he remains in kind of a limbo situation. He was denied bail as the US government is appealing the denial of his extradition. So now to discuss these issues and more, I turn you over to our Sharon Kyle from the Los Angeles branch of the Assange Defense Committee. So go ahead, Sharon. Oops, sorry, Sharon's muted. Sharon, there we go.
Okay, I'm good. Okay, thank you, Nathan, I'd like to thank everyone again for being here. We're going to be talking about the Assange issue, along with First Amendment and political prisoners. And we've entitled this presentation, Verdict First, Then the Trial. And I think it's really important that we look at this from this perspective. Verdict first, then the trial. And I think that you'll find throughout this discussion period that this is nothing new in the United States. As you're sitting and listening, if any questions come to mind, please feel free to submit your questions to the chat area. Now let me introduce you to our speakers tonight. I'm Sharon Kyle, I am your moderator. I am the publisher and co-founder of the LA Progressive, which is an online digital daily magazine that my husband, Dick Price, and I founded about 13 years ago. Tonight, we're going to be talking to our two esteemed speakers, Marjorie Cohn. Marjorie Cohn is the editor and contributor to Cowboy Republic, 6 Ways Bush Gang Has Defied the Law, and the United States and Torture, Interrogation, Incarceration, and Abuse. And also, we will be talking to Jody Armour, who is the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California, USC. He's also the author of a controversially titled book, N** GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. And I'm going to just show you a little quick screenshot of both Jody's book, which is definitely a must read, and the two books that Marjorie Cohen has authored, and she has authored others and contributed to others as well. But the two that she's highlighting tonight are The United States in Torture and Cowboy Republic. So first, let's talk about how this is going to go. Both Jody and Marjorie are going to be given 10 minutes to give just their presentation on these issues. And then the three of us are going to engage in an informal conversation. All the while, we're asking everyone in the audience to submit questions, and then we'll have a half hour to answer those questions after the discussion and presentation. So let's start off with Jody. Jody, give us 10 minutes and talk about this extremely important issue, especially given what happened last Wednesday. And you're muted.
Great, thank you. I started teaching my criminal law class today at USC, and the first topic we cover today is the presumption of innocence. And what does the presumption of innocence mean? And nothing could more fly in the face of the presumption of innocence that's supposed to be the cornerstone of our criminal justice system. Nothing could more fly in the face of that presumption of innocence than a verdict first, then the trial approach to criminal justice matters in America, right? We cannot, if the presumption of innocence means anything, it means that we have to first go to the trial, not leap to conclusions, not jump to the verdict. But, you know, there's a long tradition in American justice of going at things just that way, sadly. There was an old saying in the Bronx DA's office years ago that used to go like this: charge him with anything, prove he's an SOB, right? And what that was meant to convey, if you can prove somebody has bad character to the jury, if you can prove that they're somehow undeserving in any kind of way to the jury, you can get them convicted of anything. It doesn't matter what the charges are. You know, the elements of the crime, the jury will find the elements of the crime met if they don't like the defendant enough, almost whatever elements you give them, right? And so that is what is so pernicious about a verdict first, then the trial approach. It completely eviscerates the presumption of innocence that, you know, we celebrate as something that's supposed to be meaningful in our Constitution and in our criminal justice system. Now, let me give you a quick background on why I consider issues like Assange is involved with, that is free speech issues, so vitally important, and why it's important not to have the criminal penal system have a chilling effect on freedom of speech, freedom of press, you know, why that's so important. I'll tell you, I'm not an almost free speech absolutist, which I'm not quite, but I'm almost, you know, free speech absolutist for this reason. Not because I believe that in a free marketplace ideas, truth is going to prevail. The good ideas are going to rise to the top and beat out the bad ideas. I used to think that, but then I flew out to Poland as part of the US Embassy opening up a library in Warsaw, did a tour of major universities, and of course went through Treblinka and Auschwitz while I was there, right? And you cannot stand in Auschwitz and look at those ovens and say good ideas always prevail over bad, right? And when I came back home and thought about it on the plane, I said I didn't have to go to Poland for this insight. You know, in American history, in 1858, the Supreme Court said Black people have no rights a white person must respect, right? That wasn't good ideas prevailing over bad in a marketplace of ideas. It took a cataclysmic race war and 600,000 dead Americans to purge the stain of racism from America, not good ideas trumping bad ideas in the marketplace ideas. No, the reason I'm so big on free speech and why we must vitally protect it is as a person from a marginalized group who's often a dissenter, who's often making opinions that are cut against the prevailing grain, I cannot continue to be a dissident or a dissenter if they have the tools to crack down on dissenters and dissidents. As a Black person, as a Black Lives Matters, for example, activist, I've been involved with Black Lives Matter activists since 2013-14 now. I know how easily they will turn, if they get the power, they will start calling people like me Black identity extremists, right? And they'll start calling people like Black Lives Matter, terrorist organizations. We have to resist the temptation to allow any trammeling of our freedom of expression and freedom of press as part of that too, in order to protect the right of marginalized groups who are subordinated, who are resisting oppression, who are resisting the status quo, to continue that fight. I can think of few things more dangerous, frankly, and I know this is going to be unpopular for a lot of people to hear. I can think of few things more dangerous than monopolies, and media platforms telling people who can and can't be on Twitter or any other platform. Without Twitter, you don't have Black Lives Matter in the way we have it now. Black Lives Matter, the Twitter was just the lifeblood of Black Lives Matter. It helped to make the movement. If you had, monopolists out there saying, well, we think that some of the things that Armour and some of these Black Lives Matter people saying is a little extreme, we're gonna have to shut them down. Imagine how that could have hurt, the last 6-7 years of history. And these marches over the summer were made possible by that kind of effective free speech, free political speech through, places like Twitter, not always popular, but necessary if marginalized groups are going to be able to fight for our, equality and freedom. I think that's about my 10 minutes. I'll be glad to dive in more once we get back into it.
Oh, I can't wait. Thank you so much, Jody. Okay, so now we're going to hand the time over to Marjorie Cohn. Marjorie, take it away.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm delighted to be here. And as Nathan said, the judge in the Assange case denied Trump's motion to extradite him to the United States to stand trial on charges under the Espionage Act, which would garner him possibly 175 years. And she based it on the fact that really an indictment of the US prison system, because it's so brutal that it could not protect him from committing suicide. He would be in virtual solitary confinement. He would be subjected to special administrative measures, which would basically isolate him from every other human being. And there was a lot of expert testimony by mental health professionals saying that because of his mental health, he would almost definitely commit suicide. So she said, no, I'm not going to grant the motion. But in a 132-page decision, she basically bought all of the Trump administration's arguments, which is, I think, fits right into our theme of first the verdict, then the trial. She prejudged all these issues and then said, but the US courts will give him a fair trial and decide these issues. And really, what she upheld was the criminalization of national security journalism. This is the first time that a journalist has been indicted under the Espionage Act for publishing truthful information. Journalists are allowed to publish material illegally obtained by a third person, in this case, Chelsea Manning, if it's a matter of public concern. And the US government has never prosecuted a journalist or a newspaper for publishing classified information. So why were they so hot to get Julian Assange? Well, it's not because of his personality or allegations that have been proven false against him. It's because Julian Assange and WikiLeaks had the gall, had the nerve to reveal evidence of US war crimes. That's really what this is all about. What WikiLeaks published, and by the way, this is the same thing that the New York Times, Der Spiegel, Le Monde did as well, which is why Obama, who went after whistleblowers under the Espionage Act, like no other president before him, declined to prosecute Assange, because if they prosecute Assange and WikiLeaks, they would have to prosecute the New York Times as well. They called it the New York Times problem. So what did WikiLeaks and Julian Assange reveal? The Iraq war logs, 400,000 field reports about the Iraq war and 15,000 unreported deaths of Iraqi civilians, and evidence of the systematic murder, torture, and rape by the Iraqi army and authorities ignored by US forces. They published 90,000 reports about the war in Afghanistan, including the Afghan war logs, which recorded more civilian casualties by coalition forces than the US military had reported. And they published the Guantanamo files, 779 secret reports about the US government's torture and abuse of 800 men and boys in violation of the Geneva Conventions and the Convention Against Torture. But perhaps the most notorious revelation was the collateral murder video from 2007 in Baghdad, showing a US Army Apache helicopter gunship targeting and firing on unarmed civilians in Baghdad, killing at least 18 civilians, including 2 Reuters reporters and a man who came to rescue the wounded. Then an army truck drove over one of the bodies. 3 different violations of the Geneva Conventions. Now, recently, Donald Trump pardoned 4 Blackwater mercenaries who committed war crimes also in Baghdad, also in 2007. They were convicted, they were serving long prison terms, but the army, the soldiers in the helicopter in the collateral murder video were never charged with anything. And did Trump pardon Julian Assange? No, he charged him with 175 years under the Espionage Act for publishing evidence of war crimes. What is wrong with this picture? And by the way, national security journalism, if publication of the national security secrets violated the Espionage Act, we wouldn't know about US government misconduct in the so-called war on terror. We wouldn't know about the secret CIA black sites, which the Washington Post exposed during the Bush administration. We wouldn't know about the torture and abuse of prisoners in Afghanistan and Iraq that the New Yorker and 60 Minutes too disclosed. And we wouldn't know about the warrantless surveillance program revealed by the New York Times. So that's why this prosecution of Julian Assange is so critical, because it is a dagger straight into the heart of national security and investigative journalists. And it's really important that we, in any way we can, make our voices known to stop this and pressure Trump to pardon him. He still has a few days left. He can do a lot of harm. He could do a little good if he wanted. And then Biden, if Trump does not pardon him or dismiss the indictment, then we need to pressure Joe Biden, the incoming president, to either dismiss the indictment or to pardon Julian Assange.
Thank you, Marjorie. So I do want to get back to that, the idea of pardoning Julian Assange or dropping all charges. But first, let me come back to something that Jody talked about briefly, and that was his position on, which I think it's a free speech issue, Twitter. Recently, Donald Trump was banned from Twitter, and Jody was touching on something, and I think it has something to do with that and free speech and these oligarchs of social media having so much control. So Jody, you want to expand upon that, your position about Twitter?
Yes, that's you couldn't have put it any better, that you have oligarchs who have a monopoly pretty much, and more than pretty much, because we used to always hear, well, if you don't like what you're getting from Twitter, if you don't like having any interference in your communications from Twitter, you can always go somewhere else. Somewhere else might be someplace like Parler, which was created as an alternative to Twitter, right? And a lot of conservatives started going over to Parler when Twitter looked like was making noises like it was going to start being more active and regulating speech on Twitter. And so what happens? Apple Twitter, and Google get together and take Parler out. So that's no longer an alternative. So you really don't have any alternative if these oligarchs, as you say, if these folks who have a monopoly on these particular platforms decide that the politically correct thing at this moment is to crack down on the speech of these particular people who are saying things that we find objectionable, but not those people who may be saying equally objectionable things, but they are political favorites. You know, they are not subject to the same kind of scrutiny. And it can often be very difficult to distinguish one from the other. We have a group here in LA, for example, in Koreatown that's done a lot of great work for houseless people and equal justice when it comes to housing. And they were knocked out by Twitter with this kind of dragnet approach. They were caught up in all this. So, you know, this critical work that they've been doing, progressive work on the streets for houseless people, has now been, you know, kind of stamped out by this effort by Twitter to look good running up to, you know, the inauguration. So it's something that worries the hell out of me as someone who is often fighting against entrenched power and privilege. And knowing that entrenched power and privilege, if they have the fourth estate on their side and all the alternative media as well, like Twitter was what used to be a way around the New York Times and around the Washington Post, right? But now when Twitter becomes owned by the oligarchs and some of them are merging together, you really are, you know, again, you're left with few options, and we need to fight that tooth and nail.
Thank you, Jody. So Marjorie, let's get back to the pardoning, but I still want to bring in some of these media issues, because the corporate media has really failed to cover this story and what is happening with Julian Assange. And I think that we have become so dependent on independent media, social media, to get the word out. So Marjorie, if we are urging for a pardon or a dropping of the charges, how do you see this issue? Still, we're still in a very vulnerable position. Assange might be free, but what about the overall issue of this inequality? Go ahead, Marjorie.
Yes, well, as I said, Barack Obama, his administration went after whistleblowers under the Espionage Act more than all other presidents combined. So just having a Democratic president is not going to guarantee that national security journalism, investigative journalism, whistleblowers who are blowing the whistle on government misconduct, government law breaking, are going to be protected. It means that we have to struggle in any way we can. And I see no difference in the Biden administration. Of course, it remains to be seen, but Joe Biden at one point when he was vice president called Julian Assange a, what did he call him? A terrorist, a national journalist terrorist, or high-tech terrorist. Mm-hmm. He called him a high-tech terrorist. And, you know, this is also talking about what's happening now and the insurrection and what happened on January 6th and what will continue to happen. Just because Trump is gone does not mean that the right-wing fascists, the mob, the thugs are not going to continue. This is a very powerful movement. But Joe Biden and other people called them domestic terrorists and harped on that. And you will, I bet, that you're going to see a push in the Congress. There is no crime of domestic terrorism. They're going to create a crime of domestic terrorism. And you know who they're going to use it against? They're going to use it against the left. They're going to use it against Muslims. They're going to use it against people of color. So I think we also, while we're protecting Julian Assange and the right to national security journalism, we have to resist criminalizing domestic terrorism. I'm not advocating it, but once you create a crime of domestic terrorism, it's going to be used against Black Lives Matter protesters and people in this country, Muslims, and people who are challenging governmental policies.
Okay, so I want to stay on this issue of domestic terrorism. So Marjorie is saying that we don't currently have a crime of domestic terrorism. Once one is put in place, I can clearly see who's probably going to be targeted. If we look at history, history teaches us any lessons. Black and brown people who are dissidents better start hiding right now. So how do we address these issues? I mean, look at what happened Wednesday. Do you have a vision for how we would address these? And I guess I'm posing this question to you, Marjorie, but Jody, please feel free to jump in.
Well, I think that, you know, building a mass movement and supporting a mass movement like we saw with the anti-white supremacist protesters in the wake of the public lynching of George Floyd, thousands and thousands of people all over the country in the streets. That is what it's going to take. It's going to take many levels, mass action. It's going to take people lobbying, legislators. It's going to take journalists. And this is where people like Julian Assange are so important, revealing the truth and calling out real lawbreaking from the right, from the corporations, from the government. And so it's a multi-pronged strategy. This is not something that we can accomplish in a short period of time. The polarization in our society is so deep. And, you know, Donald Trump didn't create the racists. They were always there. What he did was to unleash them. He gave them permission to show their faces, to come out. And so we have a combination, and Donald Trump, his entire campaign was steeped in racism from the very beginning, from when he co-founded the birther movement, all the way through his campaign, all the way through his presidency. But it's also the evangelical Christians, not all of them, but many of them, who see him, and now he's saying, I'm the chosen one, see him as the Messiah. This is a movement that is going to be very, very difficult to contain. And what we saw at the Capitol building on Wednesday, in stark contrast to the way the overwhelming police violence against anti-racist protesters and Black Lives Matter demonstrators, just, you know, unbelievable numbers of arrests, the use of vast use of chemical weapons, beating heads, rubber bullets, tremendous violence. And we saw a completely different response. The protesters, the insurrectionists did break windows to get in, but once they got in, they were directed to offices. They were allowed to have their way with Congress. It's a miracle that half of Congress wasn't killed in the process. And so we saw a very different police reaction. Now there are reports that Donald Trump resisted calling in the National Guard, but what we're going to see in the next period of time leading up to the inauguration, and I think the 17th is a date that the insurrectionists, the fascists have announced that they're going to have protests all over the country, is National Guard coming out. And, you know, we saw those phalanx of National Guardsmen against largely peaceful, and I want to say completely peaceful, because I don't consider property damage to be violence. I consider damage to human beings to be violent. And so we have a totally different situation with the phalanx of National Guard using overwhelming force against the anti-racist, anti-white supremacist protesters. And we saw, you know, very little police pushback on Wednesday. But I think because people are reeling, including some Republicans, from what happened, I think we're going to see a stronger police presence, and the National Guard are on their way to Washington. But this is happening in state capitals all over the country. It's going to be very, very difficult. So the only way to resist that is with a mass movement. Yes, they can do things in the legislature. Yes, things can happen through the government, through journalism. And we are really, really critical here, our role as journalists, and people like Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, critical to revealing what's really happening.
Jody?
Yeah, I'd agree really with that, everything, of course, but especially the last remarks that you made were where I see some of what happened on last Wednesday coming from. You know, I kind of looked at what was happening last Wednesday, and I saw a failure of the fourth estate of journalism in this way, for this reason. These people were being incredibly disruptive last Wednesday. There's no question about that. Really disruptive, right? And we could say that the level of disruption that they were introducing was unjustified for any reason under any circumstances. But I don't think that was a real problem we had. Some people, they kept focused on just the disruption. But BLM, I've been around BLM for a long time, and a lot of people have been calling the stuff that we've done with, I've seen BLM doing, disruptive, very disruptive, you know, shutting down highways for 10 hours at a time, 405, 110. I mean, there's been some extreme disruption there too. I don't think it's just so much the disruption that bothered me, at least when I saw what was going on Wednesday, as, you know, if for example, there truly was a national conspiracy to rob the will of the people and steal the election from the American people, I'd probably be down in DC too, okay? If I saw that kind of assault on democracy happen, and I wouldn't consider what they did so far beyond the pale that you couldn't even consider it. I don't like death in anything, of course, or tragedies in anything, but a lot of disruption for a sufficiently great cause, you know, might be justified under the right circumstances. We certainly thought so over the summer. What was so problematic about this disruption, though, is that it was not evidence-based. It was so totally fact-free. No judges had found anything in the way of evidence in support of any widespread fraud or conspiracy. No legislatures had found it. When lawmakers looked at it, there was just no evidence for it. So it's the utter irrationality of it that was so galling, I think, you know, for some of it, not just the fact that it was disruption, but the fact that they believed this, and the fact that they could believe something without evidence, without facts, tells me that people are living in their own hermetically sealed little informational silos. You know, the good side of social media is things like Black Lives Matter and the movement, which was promoted and fueled by Twitter and other social media. That's the good side of social media. The bad side is what we saw Wednesday. Those people are living in their own echo chamber, in their own hermetically sealed informational silos. And so you start to respond to the world without any contact with evidence or fact, but you have people in that informational silo telling you that you are acting perfectly reasonably and rationally. So yeah, journalism is really going to be important to lead us forward from this dark moment, or gloomy moment, I should say.
Great. So Jody, I want to pick up a little bit on this unequal justice. Your book, N*GGA theory, discusses unequal justice. And you start the book talking about, on a personal level, what you experienced through your dad's experience. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And the reason I want to bring this in is because America is looking at the bold-faced exercise of unequal justice on television every night for the past, we've just been seeing it played over and over and over again. But there are certain communities that have known about unequal justice for a very long time.
Yeah, you know, a lot of people keep asking themselves, is this us? This isn't us. This can't be us. But, you know, a lot of folk, a lot of Black people in Black Lives Matter and Black folk have recognized that this is us for a long time, you know, and I was introduced to who us were as an 8-year-old when my dad, the door to our house was kicked in by a no-knock search. Police came in, phalanx of officers, and I saw my dad prostrate on the floor. Next time I saw him upright, it was on Family Day in the Ohio State Penitentiary, and he'd been given 22 to 55 years for possession and sale of marijuana. And, you know, I had 7 siblings. So the 7 siblings and I and my mom went from a middle-class existence, a kind of, you know, if you will, Cosby kid existence, to crumbs and roaches and rats overnight. Because family separation has been happening as part of the criminal justice system in America for 100 years, ago 50 years especially, it's blown up. Family separation everywhere, all the time. My dad, you know, was looking at that 55 and rotting in that jail cell. he reached up on the warden's shelves of his library, started pulling down law books, taught himself criminal law, constitutional law, criminal procedure, started writing his own writs of habeas corpus, representing himself pro se, and using this typewriter right over here. This typewriter, right? I don't know if you can see it. I wish I had more light. There's a typewriter right here, a manual Royal typewriter that if I had a little more light, you could see better. He used that on his cell floor to type up his writs of habeas corpus until I joined him as a 14-year-old in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati. You know, Cincinnati is where the Underground Railroad came up. So black bodies in bondage, if they could get from Kentucky to Cincinnati, they were free. He was another black body in bondage in Cincinnati in the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeal, arguing before an en banc panel of judges, literally for his life, in a case called Armour versus Salisbury. I teach the case now in my class, and it stands for the proposition that it's a denial of due process for a DA to lie to the jury to convict the defendant. So that was his journey, and I've seen firsthand that there's a lot of injustice in American criminal justice generally, and that's one of the reasons I want to be able to tell that story, him to be able to tell his story. He's not going to be able to tell that story. I'm not going to be able to tell that story on his behalf as effectively as I'd like if there's some kind of censorship, if you have some kind of trammeling of freedom of expression and political speech. It's as simple as that.
Thank you, Jody. Now, Marjorie, what I'm wanting now is, can we draw some parallels with what's happening with Julian Assange and those in our society who are marginalized, who have unequal legal representation? What about the Assange case? What about the Assange case looks very much like the unequal justice so many others feel? And I'm really talking about his reputation being smeared.
Yes, you'll recall that there was an investigation in Sweden of sexual assault charges, which turned out to be trumped up, and the two women came forward and said, no, these really didn't happen. But it wasn't until that didn't happen until the corporate media had really tarred and feathered him. And I have no doubt that those allegations, which never resulted in any criminal charges, and Sweden completely dismissed the investigation. But I have no doubt that if Julian Assange is ever extradited to the United States, the corporate media will paint him as a sexual abuser, even though there is no evidence of that. And that would impact his right to a fair trial. That plus the solitary confinement, 23 hours a day, which amounts to torture. It can lead to catatonia, hallucinations, and suicide, especially with his mental problems, his PTSD, his depressive disorder, which several psychiatrists testified to, but also the denial of right to counsel, which a lot of people, ordinary people, suffer from in our society every day. When if he is extradited to the United States, he would be in a supermax prison where he would have less contact with his lawyers. The conversations would be monitored, and this is, I was a criminal defense attorney for many years, and this is what poor people face. So there are real parallels, even though Julian Assange has top-notch legal representation. He would not get a fair trial, and this was one of the real travesties of the decision of the London judge, of the British judge, even though she denied extradition based on that the US prison system couldn't protect him against suicide. She said, well, I don't see any evidence that he would not get a fair trial in the United States. And the indictment against him is filed in a district in Virginia where they bring all of the so-called war on terror cases. And there is a very, very conservative corporate military jury pool that they draw from. And I think that there would be real problems with Julian Assange getting a fair trial if he were extradited to the United States.
So Marjorie, you spoke just briefly about if Julian Assange were in the United States, that it would, and if he was in a supermax, that would affect his ability to have counsel Like, let's say he was placed in a Supermax facility in Colorado. How would that impact his ability to have good legal counsel? For those who have no idea what that's about.
Well, there was testimony that came out at his extradition hearing that because he is charged under the Espionage Act, he would be housed with people who have been convicted of terrorism offenses in this Supermax prison in Colorado, where he would be locked down for 23 hours a day, virtual solitary confinement, have almost no contact with other human beings, and be subject to what are called SAMs, special administrative measures, where he would be, his conferences with his lawyers would be restricted. We saw with Lynn Stewart, an attorney who is now no longer with us, but was representing one of the cases in the War on Terror, and her client was subject, and she was subject to these special administrative measures, and they were listening in. The prison authorities and the government were listening in on the attorney-client communications, which is sacrosanct. If there is no confidentiality between attorney and client, then there can be no fair trial. Then there can be no effective representation. And that's what Julian Assange would be facing if and when he were ever extradited to the United States.
Right, right. Well, I suspect that just based on history, I remember listening to a talk between Noam Chomsky and Angela Davis, and they were doing a comparison between COINTELPRO and Watergate. And Noam Chomsky made the point that if you ask anyone, any American or anyone in any country, if they've ever heard of Watergate, most people have. But if you ask them about COINTELPRO, you're not going to get the same response. And he attributed that to who was it that was victimized. So in COINTELPRO, we all know now that they were primarily leftists, blacks, brown people. That's who J. Edgar Hoover was watching day and night. But when we look at Watergate, it was the DNC, I believe it was, who was broken into. So Jody, I want to talk a little bit more about this unequal justice and respectability politics, and how you and I had a 2-second conversation before this began. And I said, I'm not going to use that word, but you go ahead and you use it. Let's talk about this smearing and how it's done.
Sure. And I'll just touch on, before I get to that, the smearing and how it's done, the COINTELPRO connection, which is such a great one, and that comparison to Watergate. There's a movie getting ready to come out called Judas and the Black Messiah by Fred Hampton in Chicago, who was killed. It's talking about a real people's movement, tying class and race together, doing some great things, and was taken out. And you'll see in the movie and in the historical record that has some COINTELPRO connections to it as well. So yeah, racial justice rears its head again. And I think racial justice in a strange way even rears its head when it comes to some people on the left, or who call themselves liberals, who want Assange so bad, not so much because he leaked information or got information out into the world that's had to be out there about, some corrupt war operations and practices, but he also might have hurt Hillary Clinton's chances of election somehow by, somehow helping the Russians get some information. Yeah, I'm always confused when I'm trying to follow the narrative that's being painted, but I know this much of it. They're trying to blame 2016's election results on the Russians in some way, right? Rather than on good old American racism, homegrown white identity politics. And now you see in 2020 that you don't need the Russians to explain 75 million Americans casting a ballot for Trump. Trump got more ballots cast for him than any other person in American history except Biden, right? So it wasn't the Russians, it was us, right? But people are kind of caught up with this other narrative and going after him for that reason. So in my book, I talk about the monsterization, otherization, demonization, I call it niggerization, of defendants in a lot of trials when we want to throw the book at them, when we want to damn them and condemn them. Like I said, going back to that Bronx, statement in the DA's office, charge him with anything, prove he's an SOB. If you can go and smear their character, you can get a lot of sympathy even for horrible things that you're doing to them. And where you really saw this? Black Lives Matter brought this home, and with respect to respectability politics. What they started recognizing early on in the Black Lives Matter movement, when you saw that procession of hashtags that made up the movement, Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, Walter Scott, Eric Gardner, right on down the line, Philando Castillo, you saw that what they would immediately start doing when one of these unarmed Black victims was shot by a police officer is putting that victim on trial. They go back and look at his Facebook post and see, I think I might have seen a picture of him giving somebody the finger. So we'll he wasn't an angel if he was giving somebody the finger, or, he wasn't an angel of this. So they would often, Walter Scott, he was shot 6 times in the back by the police officer, but why wasn't he keeping up his child support? Did they start bringing up, with Eric Gardner, they'll say, well, why wasn't he, why was he selling Lucy's on the sidewalk? So by demonizing the victim, by otherizing them, niggerizing them, they knew that they would rob them of sympathy and make it easier to convict them or to let off the hook the people who were persecuting them. And so that's the standard part of the playbook. And Black Lives Matter said, no, you do not have to be Dudley goddamn Do-Right. You do not have to be morally immaculate to deserve decent treatment as a human being by state actors like the police, right? And so they have completely thrown out that old playbook on respectability politics that says we're going to scrutinize the character of the alleged victim. Remember when they used to do that with sexual assault victims? If you're a sexual assault victim, but we got to go back into your character and history before we can know how to look at your claim. That way of approaching things is wrong-headed, and it's certainly what we've seen going on with the Assange case.
Great. Thank you. Marjorie, let's talk a little bit about political prisoners. You've written about this. Why don't you, we can compare what's happening with Julian Assange, but there are dozens or maybe hundreds of political prisoners right now in the United States, and even outside of the United States. I would consider Assata Shakur not a political prisoner, but she's a prisoner in respect that she can't come home. So let's talk a little bit about how this is all tied in, the same old thing.
Well, yes. I mean, these political prisoners are generally Black people and people who have challenged the status quo, the government. We have Mumia Abu-Jamal, who is, talk about journalists. He is one of the smartest, most insightful, most important journalists in the country today. And yet he has been locked up for years and years. And it's not with many appeals, and it's not clear what is going to happen ultimately to him, but he should be released. Leonard Peltier, another political prisoner, Assata Shakur, who, by the way, has been living for many years in Cuba. The Cubans have given her asylum, and she was, with the Black Panther Party. And I wanted to say something and pick up on a little bit on what Jody said, what you said and what Jody said about COINTELPRO, which means counterintelligence program, where they were spying on leftists, they were spying on socialists, they were spying on Black people, they were spying on Martin Luther King Jr. They put wiretaps in his hotel room. They tried to drive him to divorce and even suicide. And they were particularly threatened by Martin Luther King Jr. when he came out against the Vietnam War. And they eventually killed him. But I also want to use this as an opportunity to say that on Monday, which is Martin Luther King Day, the hearings will begin in the Commission of Inquiry into Systemic Racism against people of African descent, and it's an inquirycommission.org is the website, and I'm involved in this as a rapporteur. And hearings are going to be public from January the 18th until February the 6th. Go to inquirycommission.org. And we are going to have hearings in all of the cases that Jody mentioned and many, many more. We're going to have hearings from family members of Black people who have been killed by police, many of them unarmed, non-threatening to police, murdered by police. We're going to have testimony, and then we're going to write a report and submit it to the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. And the reason we're having our commission was because 600 groups went to the UN Human Rights Council and said, let's convene a commission about racism against Black people by police and the killings of Black people by the police in the United States. And there was a lot of support for that. And then the Trump administration said, oh, no, 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 we can't just look at this in the United States. And they squelched it. But what the Human Rights Council did was to task the High Commissioner of Human Rights with writing a report. And so our commission is going beyond what a UN commission would have done and actually holding hearings with victims' families, with their lawyers, writing a report to submit to the High Commissioner. So that starts on Martin Luther King Day, Monday, with the hearings, public hearings on Zoom, and it's called inquirycommission.org, and it's a very, very important effort. I highly recommend that people tune in.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Marjorie. So both of you have talked quite a bit about the role that media has played in really preventing progressives, those who are on the left, Black Lives Matter, preventing them from having a powerful movement. Where do you think we are as a progressive movement in terms of uniting and getting behind independent media? I say that as the publisher of the LA Progressive, a tiny little outfit here in Southern California. But Marjorie, you often write for Truth Out, which is a fantastic outlet, but certainly doesn't get the readership that it deserves. Do you see any hope? And I'm going to put this to you, Jody, and and Marjorie, I'm going to ask you, do you have any ideas for how we can strengthen and bolster up the fourth estate? Jody.
Yeah, you know, when you talk about independent media, you know, I have a colleague over the Annenberg School of Journalism, Alyssa Richardson, who has been writing about the journalism that has arisen out of the bearing witness folks using their cameras during Black Lives Matter protests and marches all the way back 2014, 15 up to, you know, this summer, and how much they have been street level journalists in a way and redefining what journalism is. And it's one of the reasons I'm so concerned about preserving, you know, our independence on media platforms like Twitter, but also it highlights the importance of creating and supporting other independent media, because we see what can happen over there with Twitter. You know, who knows? Whereas if we have an independent media source, you know, publication and other kinds of sources that we are supporting, then even if the oligarchy gets together and says, we're going to squelch these voices on Twitter, you know, Apple and Google and Twitter all get together, they won't be able to do that with these independent organs of information. So, you know, that is, it's recognizing the need for that and getting people motivated to support that media. That's the trick. And I don't know why we're not as motivated as we could and should be to develop, you know, independent media that isn't beholden to either corporation. I think that people have started to recognize with Biden getting ready to be inaugurated, with Kamala Harris, and with Garland as the new Attorney General, it's harder to imagine at the top 3 people less supportive of the kind of radical criminal justice reform that people were marching for in the streets over this summer. right? You have the architect of mass incarceration himself, Biden himself, you know, the 94 crime bill and lots of others. Kamala Harris, you know, talking about locking up parents for their truant kids and never bringing prosecutions against corrupt prosecutors. And Merrick Garland, who was, if he'd gotten on the Supreme Court, would have been not good for criminal justice issues because he's been a law and order kind of judge. To have those people at the top of the, you know, you know, Democratic Party that now has the House, Senate, and Oval Office isn't really that much of a vindication for what people were marching for in the streets over the summer. If they're going to find that vindication, it's going to have to be from an independent media and maybe an independent party, and an independent media that's supporting an independent party, or at least giving independent sources of information so people can make up their minds and not just be captive to corporate media.
Right. So Marjorie, I want to make this the last question about independent media, the media free speech, and the chilling effect that this whole Assange thing has if these charges aren't dropped. And I want you to speak from a media perspective, especially being someone who writes as much as you do. Thank you for doing what you do.
Well, yes. If Julian Assange is extradited and tried and ultimately convicted in the United States, it is going to have a chilling effect on every journalist, investigative journalist, national security journalist who writes anything critical of the government. And that includes me, and it includes you, and it includes a lot of us. And that's why it's such an important case. It really goes to the heart of what journalism is all about. And that's why this case has become a cause célèbre all over the world. Even though the corporate media ignores it most of the time. Once in a while, you know, if there's a development in the case, you'll see an article about it. And it's shameful. It's shameful because the New York Times and other corporate media did exactly what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks did. They published what WikiLeaks had actually revealed, what Chelsea Manning had leaked. And so it is a pivotal case. It's a really, really important case. And it's incumbent upon us to educate people about it. And if he is extradited, and quite frankly, I don't think he will be. I think that the judge decided on such narrow ground, this mental health ground, and there will be a series of appeals, and eventually appeals by the Trump administration. It could take months or even years. I hope he survives in prison. I think ultimately he will not be extradited, but sitting around like a loaded gun is this judge's published opinion, most of it devoted to why the arguments of the Trump administration about you know, the First Amendment issues, the fair trial issues, the journalism issues. She agreed with nearly every argument that the government made. So it's a really, really pivotal case. And I think that what we need to do is more of what we're doing. Alternative journalism and independent media is, yes, we don't have the readership that the New York Times and the Washington Post have and the other corporate media, but we are making inroads. There are more of us. Lots of people are reading it. It's penetrating the corporate media, the things that we reveal. People are getting educated about what's happening. Democracy Now! is you know, out there on television, et cetera. And so I'm not pessimistic about it, although I do agree with Jody, his criticism of Biden and Kamala Harris and Merrick Garland. They're spot on. I mean, you know, we have to get rid of Trump. He is a danger to the survival of the natural world. And so it's good that he lost, but he should have lost by much, much more. And I think that if it hadn't been for his criminal mishandling of the pandemic, where I hold him responsible for tens of thousands of deaths, I think he might well have won. So we basically eked it out. But Kamala Harris was not a progressive prosecutor in any sense of the word, although she calls herself a progressive prosecutor. And Merrick Garland has ruled against Guantanamo detainees, against the rights of criminal defendants. He is no progressive. So the way to deal with that is resistance, is pressure. They are not going to do the right thing instinctively. They are going to have to be pressured by a mass movement, by progressive media. And also, I want to encourage people, if you don't want to write an op-ed in your newspaper, write a letter to the editor. That's really important. You can get them in the New York Times. You can get them in your local paper. Keep it under about 150 words. Peg it to a news story or an opinion piece. And if your letter doesn't get published, you will help other letters from the same point of view get published, because they count up how many letters there are from each perspective. So there are a lot of things we can do. I don't expect the mass movement that we saw during the last summer to go away. I think it's only going to get stronger. And so I'm hopeful, although things have been very, very frightening lately, but we have to keep the faith and continue to struggle and continue to do that very, very important work.
Thank you, Marjorie. So this concludes this portion of our presentation, and now we're going to be going into the questions that have been submitted by our audience. And the first question asks, how can we press the Biden-Harris administration to abandon the appeal of the denial of Assange's extradition, drop all charges against him, allow him to recover his health, and return to his work of exposing government wrongdoing? How do you suggest that we press on Biden and Harris? And either of you can jump in and answer that question.
I have a couple of thoughts on that, Sharon. And that is, Biden, throughout the campaign, basically hitched his coattails to Obama. Talked a lot about Obama. Barack and I did this, Barack and I did that. You know, he really capitalized on his being vice president of with Barack Obama. And so I think that, you know, Barack Obama, again, who went after whistleblowers like nobody else, decided not to go after Julian Assange because of what they called the New York Times problem. Because if they went after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, they would have to go after the New York Times and other publications who published the same things that they did. And so I think we can appeal to Biden and say, look, Obama, your buddy, your president, did not go after Assange for these specific reasons. You should follow suit. He doesn't have to pardon him. All he has to do is drop the indictment. All he has to do is drop the appeal of the denial of extradition, and the case will go away. Julian Assange will be able to live his life. I think that that's the tack we have to take.
Thank you, Marjorie. And just a couple of people are asking, should they post their questions in the chat? Please do post your questions in the chat. I'd like to direct a question to you, Jody. One of our listeners says, to what extent do character smears and character assassination play into the chilling effect on journalism? So they're making a connection between journalism and character smears.
Yeah, you know, there's been a lot of devaluing of the role of journalists for some years now. Journalists have been, you know, put on the whipping post and reviled and denigrated. And I think it's led to the kind of degradation in our public discourse that you now see. You know, a lot of people do not have much trust and confidence in journalists because so many of their detractors have been so successful over so many years at painting journalists as all unreliable and biased and ideologically driven, etc. And it means that we don't have then many common sources of information that we can tune into and establish a basic baseline social reality that we all kind of subscribe to, endorse, and buy into. Because we, you know, so many people have panned journalists generally for so long, you know, a lot of people are just saying, I don't even want to hear what, you know, the journalists have to say. I'd rather hear what Rush Limbaugh has to say, because Rush Limbaugh is my CNN, you know, or Tucker Carlson is my, source of information, and that I'm going to go at it that way. So yeah, what are we going to do about that? How are we going to build up the bona fides of journalists again, reestablish that trust and confidence by more people, so we're sharing the same social reality again? I don't know. I'm just observing that problem. I don't know the answer.
Okay, so Jody, what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to ask you a question, and then I don't want you to give me the answer. I want you to think about it, and I'm going to come back to you, and then I'm going to go right to Marjorie. But this is a really great question. But I think that you, as a criminal procedure professor, might have a good answer for it. But I want you to think about it. And the audience wants to know, what should we do when social media is used to organize an actual crime, kidnapping, for instance? So I'm going to leave that there with you. And now we're going to go to Marjorie. And Marjorie, someone in the audience asks, what are the most egregious factual and legal errors the UK judge made in her ruling on the issues of freedom of the press relating to the revelations revealed by Assange and WikiLeaks?
Well, first of all, she said that she was not convinced that the Obama administration made a decision not to indict Julian Assange, which I found astounding. They didn't indict him. That's a decision. They could have indicted him and they didn't. She also said that, and this bought the Trump administration's argument hook, line, and sinker, that the identities of US informants in Iraq and Afghanistan were put at risk because their names were published, completely ignoring many witnesses who worked with Julian Assange in redacting the names of these informants and even alerting them that some of them were not able to be redacted. One of the witnesses says that Julian Assange was adamant that their identity should be protected. But one thing that she overlooked was that the revelations of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange actually saved lives. They saved lives because when the Iraqi government saw the revelation of some of these war crimes in Iraq and the torture centers, they denied Obama's request for immunity from criminal and civil liability for US forces who remained in Iraq. And he was forced to pull US forces out of Iraq as a result. So lives were actually saved. And also, she said, the judge, she wrote in her opinion, that Julian Assange went beyond being a journalist because he helped Chelsea Manning hack into this computer and crack a code. And there was expert testimony saying that that was impossible, that it could not have happened the way the US government said in 2010, that it was absolutely impossible. And so she almost uncritically accepted the arguments of the Trump administration. And unfortunately, all of that is out there. Now, it is not direct precedent in US cases, this written opinion of the British judge, but it's out there and it will be used, even if Julian Assange is not extradited and tried in the United States, it will be used by future US administrations to go after journalists who publish information critical of the government's policies. It's called national security journalism. And Noam Chomsky said recently in another webinar after the verdict that Dan Ellsberg and I participated in, that national security really means the government being secure from the people. And so when they scream national security, they want to be secure from revelations of the people, like what Julian Assange did. And so that's important to keep in mind.
Yes, that's a very, very important point, Marjorie. And I think that we often miss that. But that seems to be the way that they are thinking about national security. It's not really securing our nation, it's securing them. Okay, I'm going to get back to Jody and the question about social media and what should we do when social media is used to organize an actual crime, like kidnapping, for example.
Oh yeah, that's a very easy question in a way, but I think it points to a confusion that sometimes folks have when people like me say that we want to protect folks, their free speech exercise over Twitter, say, or over social media. Oh, are you saying people may wonder that people can say just anything they want over social media and they should be able to get away with it? No. If people go on social media, just like if they go on a telephone and they coordinate, they talk, they speak together, conspire, coordinate on a criminal enterprise, they're going to be criminally liable. There's no problem. We have traditional, everyday criminal rules and principles that apply to that. The place where it gets tricky, and this is the tough part, is the law of complicity. Because in the law of complicity, one way that you can commit a crime, one way you can become an accomplice to somebody who goes out and does something bad is you can encourage them. They call it, right, encouragement, not just aiding and abetting, not giving them just material support, but encouraging them. Encouraging them can mean anything from like applauding while you see something going bad, going on, you know, that might be called encouraging by some people, not by others. When you get into that kind of area of what constitutes encouragement, then you start to get into the trouble area that I'm talking about, you know, because, you know, is Donald Trump really aiding and abetting? Is he in complicity with the people that go out and do something bad? If he says, go and give them hell, go give them hell. And then they go out and they interpret go give them hell as take over the state house. And then, you know, because a lot of people, you know, Black Lives Matter activists, LGBTQ plus activists, all kinds of activists will say, go give them hell, you know, or we're going to fight for our rights and fight for your right to this and fight for that. And, you know, this is a war and a struggle and all that. There are a lot of metaphors thrown around all the time. If you start calling all of that aiding and abetting in the social media context, it's going to have a real chilling impact on socially marginalized groups who are engaging in oppositional discourse and struggling for their own survival. That's my concern, not about the more straightforward cases.
Thank you so much, Jody. And I just, I applaud you for being such an articulate and strong advocate for us marginalized people, which includes you. And particularly as it relates to independent media, you know, oftentimes, and I brought this up before, when we look at cases like the terrible tragedy of what happened to Emmett Till, if it wasn't for alternative media, Jet Magazine, we wouldn't know anything about it. Same thing with Trayvon Martin, which started out with alternative media. So
let me throw in one more quick example,
yes.
And I'll make this super quick because you're so right. We're here in LA. Without something quasi-alternative, we never would have really gotten any whiff of the Iran-Contra scandal, where you had actually CIA and Contra scandal. We have the CIA in complicity. You want to talk about complicity? There's real complicity. They were aiding and abetting the trafficking of cocaine from Colombia through Nicaragua to LA. I had Rick Ross sitting right here in this room talking to my class saying I was making $6 million a day. That's how much I was making from the cocaine coming from Nicaragua and guns going back so that Reagan could get around the Bolin amendments and go ahead and fund an illegal, you know, war down there. And so with what kept that story alive, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the oracles of the national media turned their back on that story when Gary Webb reported it from the San Jose Mercury Press and a part of his Dark Alliance series. They all, you know, the LA Times was scooped in their own backyard, so they turned on them. The New York Times, they all missed this story. The people who kept that story alive, that was the birth of Black cyberspace, right? Black folks are pinging it around, kept it alive, and the next thing you know, here comes Maxine Water holding a meeting in Town Hall in Watts, and you have Deutsch leaving the safe the confines out there in Virginia and flying out. You never saw a sitting CIA director do that before, to watch a town hall meeting, 800 angry black folks saying, what about this CIA complicity with the crack plague in the inner city, right? That's why you need alternative media. The regular media would never have gotten that story out. And that story is true. I've had to put it in a chapter with receipts. It's jaw-dropping, and it never would have come out if it was left up to the mainstream media.
That's right, Jody. And one of our audience members also mentioned LA Weekly carried that story, and LA Reader carried that story. And so we really are in debt to independent alternative media, because the corporate media is just really carrying the water of the deep pockets. So Marjorie, we have a question for you. And the question is Assange a journalist or a whistleblower? Did he actually report or simply pass information along?
Well, the whistleblower was Chelsea Manning, and she provided the information to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, who then published it. So she was the whistleblower. She was prosecuted for it, and he is a journalist. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that as he was leaving office, Barack Obama commuted Chelsea Manning's sentence to the 7 years she had already served. And that infuriated Donald Trump and drew his attention to the Assange case, that's why, one of the reasons why he went after Julian Assange. But I also want to pick up on one of the things that Jody said, and that is the Rodney King beating. If it were not for, and this was before cell phones, if it were not for George Halliday, bless his heart, who had a video camera, who videotaped this vicious beating, we would never know about it. And in fact, when people all over the world knew about that, I went to Portugal shortly thereafter, and when I met a Portuguese woman, and the first thing she said when she heard I was from the United States is, it's horrible the way police treat Black people in the United States. And when people who did police misconduct cases before the Rodney King beating, which went viral, it was very, very difficult to, when doing jury selection and asking jurors, do police lie? Do they ever engage in misconduct? No, police are fine. And after this viral video of the Rodney King beating, people said, yes, police do commit misconduct. And now we have cell phones, and a lot of the evidence that's being amassed against these insurrectionists, these fascists from Wednesday, are coming from cell phones. Another thing I want to say is one of the speaking of COINTELPRO, but this is bringing it up to the present. The FBI, this is just coming out. The FBI knew that these people were going to basically commit a war on the Capitol, to make war on the Capitol. And where were they? What did they do? I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but why weren't they prepared? Why didn't this information get out? Just something to think about.
Great. I know that's an excellent question. People are still in the chat. They're still concerned about, well, what do we do about social media when someone is putting a lie out about you? And I know that's not a crime. And if I can remember from law school, it sounds like a tort.
Yep.
Anybody?
Yep,
That's,
I teach torts first
Oh,
semester.
you do? Excellent.
And that would be a good old defamation claim, right? No problem. Yes, if they're putting out false information that it's supposed to be factual because truth is an absolute defense. Yes, that is liable. No problem, or at least some kind of defamation. We'll find some action in there. Same with invasion of privacy to some extent. But so, you're going to have to allow for some leeway in a social media platform, though. You're going to have to allow for, not everybody is always going to be, 100% on the up and up. And, when you go into the space, you got to understand that, take that into consideration, discount accordingly. We have to take some responsibility not to be utterly gullible in our consumption of, these media platforms, et cetera. So there's some responsibility on us, but Yeah, all the other rules apply. All the typical standard rules apply that were there before Twitter ever came along, or Facebook, or Instagram. And yeah, there's some wrinkles, and we can get into those, but they aren't, the lion's share of the rules are the same as always.
So Marjorie, you gave us, you shed some light on the legal inaccuracies and the legal errors that the judge made in the United Kingdom. Someone asked, is the basis of the appeal based on the factual errors that the judge made?
The appeal is just to the narrow issue that she denied extradition on, which is the danger of suicide and what would happen to him if he were sent to the United States and housed in a supermax prison under these special administrative measures. So it's a very narrow issue, which is why I think that the appeal is going to fail and he will not be extradited ultimately, assuming he survives with his very serious health issues, both mental and physical, with COVID, the COVID virus all over this high security prison where he is. But no, the Trump administration now, and hopefully it will not be pursued by the Biden administration, but the Trump administration can only appeal on that narrow ground that she denied extradition about, which is the mental health issues.
Thank you. So someone wants to know, Jody, these devices that we use now, these our cell phones, and then Marjorie brought in what happened in Lakeview Terrace with Rodney King. I think of Lakeview Terrace because I actually lived in that neighborhood at the time that happened. And at the time I had a son, and I still have that son, but he was a teenager. And I was always afraid. And I still am afraid, actually. He's not a teenager anymore, and I'm always afraid of what might happen to him if he has a bad interaction with police. But now that we have our cell phones, Jody, someone is asking, what about the possibility of the device just being taken and smashed? And I just want to put in a plug here for the ACLU that has an app, the social, I got to bring it up on my phone, that has an app that begins recording and uploading immediately to the ACLU, so that if your phone is taken from you and destroyed, they get the footage. But Jody, can you talk to that?
Oh yeah, that's it. You know, there are a number of apps popping up now that are helping people preserve information that they may be recording, even if their device is taken away by law enforcement and smashed or in some other way damaged, because law enforcement has been doing that. There have been more than 1 or 2 cases of that happening. So it's a real concern. And folks are out here developing, you know, tools to help address that. But people really just gotta recognize that they have that right. It's one of the great accountability tools and democratic accountability tools that are out here, and we have to use it, you know, kind of as an expression of accountability and the democratic will. So I really I'm man, can you imagine, for example, how difficult it would be for people to believe that there is the kind of bias there is in the police department if there wasn't all of this footage captured on cell phones over the summer, when we saw police brutality against oftentimes peaceful protesters, and we're able to juxtapose those images against the ones we saw last Wednesday. And with that juxtaposition, that jarring juxtaposition of those two encounters, those two interactions between citizens and the police, where the police are interacting with citizens who they share political beliefs with, right? Most police unions supported Trump. Most police rank and file support Trump. So police were policing their own political soulmates when it came to DC. Compare their responses to how they policed people over the summer, right? Black Lives Matter and their allies, who they didn't see as political soulmates, who they saw as political adversaries. And you see right away, thanks to technology, that police are not neutral umpires. They are not neutral referees. They have a dog in the fight. They have a side that they're on, right? And that it's thanks to this device, these cell phones, that we have that stark and incontrovertible evidence.
That's right. And not just cell phones, but there is other footage, like Marjorie, you talked about the footage that was captured in this military offensive, just killing civilians with, I believe it's drones that were used. We were able to see that footage, we being the Julian Assange Defense Committee, and we presented it at UCLA Law, and you were on the panel along with me. But that footage was very difficult to come by. How can we continue to protect the, it's really our only way of seeing the country in a more accurate way. I'm looking at what's happening with Facebook and Twitter, and some people are saying that Netroots, the term is escaping me, where our rights to see this information are being impinged upon. Do you have a view as what we can do about this, Marjorie?
Well, I really think the proliferation of individual cell phones, regardless of whether the government wants us to be filming things or not, they're going to be filmed. And people are going to take these pictures, and it's going to get out. And we have those tools now much more than in the time of the Rodney King beating. I mean, if George Halliday hadn't been there with his video camera, and we had big video cameras in those days because we didn't have the little cell phones, we never would have seen that. So I think that regardless of what the government wants, we are going to continue. They're not going to get rid of cell phones. So this is going to happen, and it's going to proliferate on independent media, and it's also going to continue to proliferate in corporate media as well.
Great. Well, we're coming to an end. We promised that this would be 90 minutes, and we're approaching the 85th minute. I want to thank Jody Armour, who comes to us from USC, where he teaches law. I understand now that he teaches tort, Crim Pro, and what else?
Torch Crim Pro and an upper level boutique jurisprudence offering.
Ooh, that sounds tasty. And Marjorie, oh my gosh, you have been just committed to this fight for decades. And I really want to thank you, Marjorie, as a woman standing toe-to-toe with power, speaking against power when power is abused. So our organization, our group, is the Julian, the Defense for Assange. I'm always getting the name mixed up, and one of the reasons I get the name mixed up is because we changed the name a few times in the beginning. The Assange Defense Committee, and you can find it at assangedefense.org, where you can find events. Keep up to date with what our next presentations, which I think there is one on January the 17th, perhaps. The sponsors for this is the Courage Foundation, the LA Progressive, and the Julian Assange Defense Committee. We thank you all for attending, and we encourage you to keep coming back, because we've got to continue to unite and remain vigilant in this fight that's probably going to be for the rest of our lives. Good luck to everybody. Stay safe. And with that, I shall say good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. That was great.
Oh, good. I'm glad that it was great. Sometimes I get lost. I'm trying to read, and I know that thank you so much, Nathan, because you sent me some texts that were absolutely awesome.
No worries at all.
And then Dick came over.
We are still live, so I'll go ahead and end this
Okay.
here.
Yeah, end it.